Cool. So
All right,
I'm
batter up.
going to be demoing the example Storybook repository. Can everyone see my screen? It should be web browser on the left and then my editor on the right. Sorry, my Zoom just went away. Yes, we're good. Cool.
Looks good.
Sweet. So just high level overview of this repository. It's basically the tutorial with a couple of extra components in there and Storybook configuration to really highlight Redwood's rich feature set. Can kind of read about some of the design decisions in the README, but this presentation is gonna follow loosely the agenda set out in this issue, where trying to better document the project layout. So to start, we're going to be talking about the, I guess, interaction testing. Actually, I'm going to skip to the deploy real quick just to show off what that looks like in production. So here it is out on Netlify. And so before I skip to the end, I just want to say that this presentation is for those familiar with Redwood, but not necessarily Storybook. So I'm going to be backing into talking about what the Storybook integration looks like in Redwood and how people might leverage it in their own Redwood apps. So I thought I had this ordered better from top to bottom, but no worries. So one thing I wanted to highlight here is this example repository shows how you might want to build and deploy to Netlify. Something to call out that this is still a proof of concept. There's some things that we want to work through on the Redwood side to better integrate with Storybook. So this is it. It's its final product. It's out there. It looks pretty good, but something to note is things that you might expect to work don't quite. So right here, there's this docs page where the idea is in Storybook is that you can see it displayed and twiddle the knobs of the component. And then it gives you a little bit more in terms of the component itself and what the code behind that might look like. So this is the running Storybook instance, but here out on Netlify, we don't see what we would expect, which is the article component. And this has to do with, as I mentioned, the deployment proof of concept still being in a state of ideation. So we got to get a little bit better. It does work here running locally. So for that same component, we have the article, same exact component, the full. And if I go to the docs, this will show what we'd expect. So that is something to call out for those who might be expecting a full deploy, production deploy to behave as it does locally. There is still this small gap, but it does work. And as an example, somebody can go and look at this command, which if you're not familiar, all it's really doing is building Storybook. And then it's also building out the Netlify path. Now, this might not be necessary. There might be a way we can skip this per se. The real reason that we're doing this is to get the directory that Netlify expects. And so this is just an example of how one might deploy to Netlify. Now, different providers might have slightly different deployment mechanisms. So that's something to note if you're not targeting Netlify. But over time, I want to capture all of those requirements and get a better understanding so that this just works out of the box and we don't need to do anything there. So yeah, that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. But then another one, and forgive me if I'm jumping ahead on Storybook. I know I mentioned no familiarity needed, but what Storybook is at a top level is kind of this tool to allow you to find the components that you have written stories for. So I was looking at the article, and then allow these nice preview panel in the right, where that allows you to view the component in isolation. So sometimes it's hard to get at working state of a component with all the expected props and everything. And what Storybook allows you to do is kind of wire all that up. And we do that in the form of a story. So what we're looking at here, let me go to the live running dev instance so you can kind of see what's happening as I do it. So what's happening here is we've written this story that this particular component requires, well, it doesn't require, but it can take comments. So this is a little bit of an advanced topic, but for certain components that require data fetching, Redwood provides some helper functions to be able to do that for you. Now, what's happening here is this is at the story level, but there's this also concept of the global Storybook configuration, where you could, in theory, have this happen at a higher level so that any story has this particular comment available to it. It just so happens that I know I need it here, and I don't necessarily want it other places. I might want slightly different things somewhere else. So I did not wire this up globally, but what all it's really doing is taking the mock, believe, comment, or it's making some random comments here. And then this is like the Storybook kind of magic, so to speak. So it knows it has this component story format. This is the 2.0. You'll notice I linked in that. I believe there's some comments somewhere, maybe not this particular issue, but on the Redwood itself, there is an ability to make some of this stuff more terse. And the benefit there is Storybook just knows out of the box if we use this like default export, how to wire some of this stuff up. So you actually don't potentially need to even have this summary. But for now, we do. I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader if they're interested in learning more about that. But what's happening here is, and this has to do with what I mentioned around some of the mock data injection, and there's a potential weird bug with hot module reload that we're still working through. But what I can do to demonstrate a different article, this one's not the best because the mock data isn't as malleable as like a prop. But what we can maybe do is let's see if changing the name here will change that hot module reload and get it to work. Let's see the demo guides. Okay, cool. It didn't change the comment name like I'd expect, so I'd need to look at why this particular guy isn't working as expected, but that's okay. So, but this is just the code behind the story that you're seeing here, and yeah, so as you saw, hot module reload is sporadic. I'm not sure why one save worked and the other didn't, but that will be fixed eventually. Now, let's going down the line here, interaction testing. So what's a nice thing about Storybook is that it allows you access to, it has some nice like jest wrappers, similar to Cypress. It allows you to provide these things called play functions, which essentially give you access to the DOM, and you can find particular elements similar to if you're familiar with React testing library or like a Cypress and type testing framework. You can essentially target specific elements in the DOM and manipulate them. So right here, I'm selecting this input, I'm typing this test comment name, and then continuing down the line. And I'm actually submitting the form here, which is why, if you noticed when I first ran it, it's actually going to go away because the behavior of this component is to essentially like submit and pop up a toast. So this isn't the best example of a interaction test, but you can really see the power of an interaction test and the ability to not only run through the functionality of a component, but then you saw how I was able to leverage the Storybook tool to go forward and kind of test my assumptions step by step to make sure that I was able to type in the input field and then it did display what I expected it to. So that's pretty neat thing there. One thing you might notice is if you're familiar with Storybook is this is not the default layout, this color scheme and everything. We can probably show that without it. So what I'm going to do here is actually comment this whole file out. And so what the manager is, I mentioned that Storybook is a tool that allows you to search for your components and display them over here. So the preview, that configuration file is everything in this preview window, and the manager is every part of the UI. So you can think of that as like these tabs and these other tabs down here. And so what I've done is I've actually provided a custom Redwood theme that does things like adds the logo and the color branding and things. But if I were to turn that off, it should default back to the regular Storybook scheme if that works. Cool. So this is what Storybook looks like for people just configuring it in Redwood, but you can see kind of the power of the customization of the tool, where I was just able to provide just basic theme, not too many color schemes. I probably went a little bit too, you don't need all these to get the result, but essentially, there you go. Another thing to note is I believe I mentioned, where is it? Yeah, config. I mentioned that you could do interaction testing. So I believe this is an opt-in feature. So just calling out how you might configure different parts of Storybook. It's not out of the box. This example repo provides it. And I believe there's links to the docs to be able to understand better how it's configured, because a lot of it's been configured for you in this repo. So for somebody who's not familiar with Storybook, this might seem like magic out of the box, but I do encourage people to look at the docs on that one. Another thing you might have noticed is the first story here is kind of like almost looks like a markdown file, and that's because it is. It's one of these MDX stories, and so this is just a really rudimentary introduction. I kind of took the example, the introduction MDX that you get from Storybook, and I adapted it to add some Redwood flavor here. But you can actually embed your own JSX in there. You'll notice that not only does this doesn't have the best example, but you'll notice that not only does this have Markdown, but it also has some JSX going on. So that's pretty powerful for more technical writers. I like writing in Markdown personally, so having the ability to kind of suss out some documentation in Markdown and then being able to pull in the components that I'm working on, I think is pretty powerful. So you get that out of the box with Storybook itself. One thing to note here is I changed the order of the story. All right, so you'll notice that I'm putting this MDX file here. By default, I believe it's either lexicographically ordered or some other sorting. But if I were to take this configuration line out, lack of a better term, line or lines, I would expect once I reload this example to come down maybe lower if it works. No, never mind. It didn't. I mean, I might have to restart. But one thing to note is it's a little obscured how the stories get ordered. Although, yeah, whatever comes first in the stories array configuration is the one that shows up first. And by default, Redwood scans your web folder and looks for everything with the stories, like prefix, postfix, something like that. So just wanted to call that out. It's a little obscure configuration that took me a little while to figure out how to get the ordering of stories to show up, because I wanted the user to land on this introduction rather than some random component that if they're not familiar with Storybook, they might be lost. So I think this has a good introduction to some docs for those that are inclined to read the docs. MDX stories. So another nicety here is the example repo has Git pod. So for even those who aren't that familiar with setting up Redwood or Node, they don't really have to. So if they just want to start tooling around like I am doing here, this environment essentially, I mean, it's not the exact same, but they have one that's very similar to what I have here, so that everything they need to get started. And I believe it should kick off the running instance when it's done. So you'll see very similar output on the left here. Yep. So it kicks it off for you, which is really nice. Maybe alarming to some, but that's configured in Git pod, so you can actually turn that off if you don't like that default behavior. Yeah, so like I'm having it open, but you could ignore this. So here it is running, and just to demonstrate, I can show the header, just change that slightly if I can find. I lost my syntax highlighting, so I'm a little blind right now. Well, let's just show it. So I would expect this to change. There you go. Cool. So the barrier of entry here is really, really low. So I spent a little bit more time typing that out, but you can see that that's really nice for somebody who doesn't want to futz around with, you know, what version of node to get versus like does their yarn conflict in their path type stuff. Like none of that you have to care about if you just want to get started tinkering away on this project. So while it's not quite unique to this repo, I think there's some other Redwood repositories that have this. I just didn't want to call it out because I find it to be nice, low barrier of entry for new contributors. And what else we have? Oh, cool. So another thing to note for those who are interested in continuous integration and deployment, leveraging the service container provided by GitHub. And so why I do this is I'm targeting Postgres, and why I'm targeting Postgres is because I'm deploying to Netlify, and Netlify requires a data source other than SQLite. By default, Redwood configures SQLite. So in order to have a nice kind of canary in a coal mine test to ensure that what I'm doing won't break out in Postgres land, I'm able to kind of set up a test database and run those interaction tests. Not only do they happen, I forgot to mention, not only does this test happen here in Storybook itself, but there is this command right here that is going to actually call that same play function, kind of similar to a just test, and ensure that this behaves how we'd expect. And in order for it to do that, potentially, Postgres is needed. Now, this is a little bit of overkill, because if you notice before I was mentioning the mocking setup, ideally everything is mocked. We don't actually need to go out to Postgres. Right now, that's not the case, as I was mentioning before. Similarly as to why the docs don't work, there's also some weirdness with the mocking where some things are hitting the mocks and some things are going out to real Postgres. So for now, this is like a nice little safety valve type thing. But in the future, once mocking is fully done, it's not required, but you could kind of abstract this out as a pattern that any Redwood project targeting Postgres could use, not specific to Storybook itself, but anything using Postgres. So I think this is an interesting call out here, just from a CI/CD perspective. And yeah, is there any questions? I kind of like glossed over what Storybook is. I kind of wanted to kind of back into that question if anyone actually wanted to dive deeper into it. I was hoping that just demoing what the tool can do kind of gives you, illustrates that for you. So like I mentioned, getting a component in a state that you might not be able to easily do. So for example, in order for me to see what this particular comment component looks like in different variants, like moderator view and default view, I would need two users, and I'll need to log into the app, once as like a non-admin and one as an admin. But here I don't actually need to do that. Another thing for some of these is controls. This allows us, it's not the best. Do I have a good demonstration? This isn't the best example, but that's probably going to break actually. Okay. What these controls allow you to do for those components, maybe these ones are better. No, but on some components that have props that are passed in, a lot of these are kind of self-contained components that the data comes from, like GraphQL and things. But for those that don't, I really wish I had an example for you. But essentially, like if this first post was a header that we controlled that was passed in as a prop, we could twiddle the knobs. And so then, and what I mean by that is you could change the copy from first post to, you know, posts or whatever UX designer would like to see. And so I swear there's one, I'm not gonna find it because the demo gods are not kind to me today, but it's really nice to be able to like send this link to a designer and then have them see their design in real life. Like Figma mockups are nice, but they're not reflective of reality a lot of times. So what this allows them to do is see it as it would be rendered in the browser, and then have pretty fine-grained control over those things that we're trying to just like control. Yeah, I'll make a note to come up with a component that's like pretty bare bones, but then like you could pass in the label. For instance, if you wanted this label name to be something different, you could pass it in as a prop. We could probably live demo it if people want, but I don't know if there is anything people wanted to go over. Well, I'm kind of just not finding what I'm looking for. Anybody have questions while I do this?
I have a question about testing.
Sure.
So is there anything you can test here that you can't test in jest tests and vice versa? So when would you choose one over the other, or do you do both, or do you do just one?
Yeah, so that line gets blurry, and I'm not sure how it's going to depend on the team. So basically, the short answer is no. Everything you can do here in a story, you could do in a jest test. The benefit here, as you might have saw, was that you can replay. So like similar to Cypress, Cypress has the ability to record a video or screenshots. Similar to that, you don't get that in jest. You could set up the debugger and kind of like step through, but it's not a visual, where this visualizes the flow for you. So that way you don't have to like kind of parse it out in your head line by line. So like what I mean is like you could do this same thing debugging in jest, where you're like you see if you get the element, and then if you type, but the benefit here is you actually visualize it and you can see it. So that would be a reason to reach for this over a jest test, where you really want to make sure that the behavior is what you expect it to be. That's a good question, because it's really, if you notice for this particular story, it's wrapping jest and basically React testing library, it seems like. So while it's not one-to-one with jest and RTL, it's very close. So a lot of things you can do here are similar to what you could already do in jest. It's just some helper functions to be able to get at what's in the preview panel, as opposed to like the whole UI. Does that answer your question?
Cool, thanks. Yeah. And what about speed? Like if you have, typically you have hundreds and thousands of unit tests, does this scale? Can you run that many quickly in Storybook?
Yeah, I haven't run benchmarks, but for instance, the time to, there's not that many in here, but the time to run, I combine jest and the CI tests. And again, it's kind of a bad test because it's actually hitting Postgres. I guess this one's all right. To actually, because you'd want that to hit your data source. There's a lot of noise in here, but it's reasonably fast. I can benchmark it more, but it's, I guess it's not that fast. It's 30 seconds, and that's with the browser. So it's hitting the browser. So that's the difference too, where the jest is, I think, mimicking the DOM, and this is, I believe, actually using Playwright underneath the covers to do that. So it's a little bit, you would expect a bit of a performance overhead for the benefit of actually having that browser testing. So it's a little bit slower, but yeah, that's generally the trade-off when you go towards the more end-to-end route.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Aditya?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for doing this. Very helpful. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
So you mentioned we can use Zest testing library and probably Playwright for writing interactive tests, right?
Sort of. So I'm just mentioning
Okay.
what's used like underneath the hood.
Right.
It depends. You could do that, yeah, but what interaction testing is using is like their own wrappers around Jest.
Okay.
And then I believe that the interaction testing is Playwright. That when I was going to the Chromium, I believe that's Playwright
Okay.
underneath the cover. So it's pretty much abstracted away from me. So just want to be clear there.
Yeah. Got it. And is this section available, this interaction testing, when we actually deploy to, say, Netlify or any of the hosting provider?
Yep. So what's happening is it's running before I deploy. I'm running this. I'm spinning up the instance of Storybook. So I'm waiting for it to start, and then I'm actually running this test Storybook. And what this test Storybook does is some configuration stuff, and then essentially it goes through, and any story that has a play function, it will run, as well as a jest test, I think.
So,
Yeah.
I felt this was the CI part. I was wondering if I can share a link with a team member, and they can open that link and go to some specific story and click test to some specific component.
Yeah, so I don't believe deep linking into the interaction tab works, but you could very easily like take this comment form that has the interaction test. So I'll post it into, of course it breaks right as I'm demoing it, but if I were to post this into the chat, you could then take that URL, go there, click, and then your teammate could click anywhere in here, whether it be the interaction testing or somewhere else, and they could do it on their own for sure. One nice thing too is I forgot to mention, a lot of Storybook defaults we get out of the box. So they have things like light and dark mode things. So right here, you can see that this contrast isn't the best. And this is all from Storybook itself. So that has some nice like add-ons that we get. I forgot to mention that before, and it's a slight tangent, but it also does like accessibility things where it will scan each component. And this is similar to the interaction testing, where if you had a designer that was more accessibility focused, for instance, they could go and check this tab themselves and kind of see how it looks.
Great, thank you. And one other question I have, if you have time,
yeah, sure.
is
of course.
We have this Redwood thing looks amazing. Is this something we have already packaged? I'm a bit out of loop here.
Sorry, so you're saying the theme itself?
Yeah, is this already shipped to Redwood, or is this up for feedback?
This could very easily be rolled into the framework itself. Right now, all it is just this this file in the example project that just sets up some
understood
things.
Thank you.
Sure.
Pete,
thank you.
This is a lot of work. Thank you so much. Just for time, I want to move us forward, and Danny's going to do his presentation. But what? Yeah, I have a lot of questions. I'm really interested in the interaction testing. I just think there's a lot of power there to to get E to E like, testing via stories, and especially because we have cells. But so helpful to see that demo. That's really exciting. And okay, so did you create an issue on the main GitHub repo for Redwood that was kind of summarizing? I think you did. That was summarizing opportunities and next steps for bringing some of these ideas over to the framework and updating that. Yeah, could you share that?
Yeah, of course. I did. I mentioned it at the top where the deploy wasn't quite there, and that's part of that issue for sure. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. Okay,
because that could be a good place for people to follow up with some questions, because yeah, there's a lot of add-ons that you showed, how to theme, and then the things that are in the way of making deploy work right, as well as the mocks and reload, hot reload not working for those. Those are the main things right now, correct? Okay. Pete, thank you. I know you've been working on that for a long time. You put in a ton of work, so great to see you demo. We could probably kept talking about it for another 20 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you. I could also have tightened it up, so I appreciate everyone's time. Thanks.
You're good. Appreciate your time to do it. Is the best place to continue with questions to you? Would you prefer those questions to come on the umbrella issue that you created in the main framework repo, or do you want us to continue the conversation in the example Storybook repo? Doesn't matter to you.
No preference there, I guess. In the context of the framework itself, like if for example, Aditya is like request for like themes, out of the box themes, to me that would be better suited for the framework, because that would be something we could add to the framework. But let's say the theme itself, somebody wanted change in the example, then that would be a case where they might open an issue on the example to like update the colors of that particular theme in the example. So it's really just user discretion. I don't have a strong preference, but that would just be like my metric to gauge where to put it.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, Danny, over to you.
Cool. Let me share my screen. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, cool. Wrong screen, right? And you're seeing Slack.
No, I'm seeing exploring the unknown.
Yeah, okay. Zoom's just put the thing below, which is kind of nice for once. Okay, so first of all, it's not going to be a very long presentation because it's super meta. So I'll try and keep it focused a little bit on practical examples. But the presentation is mainly targeted towards the core team because we're in this post V1 era where a lot of problems we're facing are just things we don't know at all. And a lot of solutions that require us to explore things and find solutions to things that we just have no idea on how to get started. So the presentation is just about how I'm dealing with it, how I've found tools to deal with this level of unknown and complexity. But, it's not really a guide. So keep that in mind when you look through it. And challenge me on the way as well. Cool. So what I was going to talk about today is just these tools that I'm using for focusing my work when we're doing experimental roadmap priorities. To frame the conversation, I'm going to talk about how we're looking at VIT for Redwood, and how I went about trying to get VIT working with Redwood in the first place. So if someone in the public is watching this, don't get too excited just yet. It's still very, very early. It's more at an internal stage now, rather than for us to publish. It's at an experimental stage. But so when you're starting from a point where you don't have enough information, we can't really use README-driven development. And this is the problem we have, where the three things I knew going into this is that we probably need to swap Webpack, because I know from having dealt with it and written some of the pre-render code that there are certain limitations with the setup that we have with Webpack that prevents us from doing SSR properly. So I also knew that conversations with Tom, we were talking about, hey, do we want to support this idea of render modes where not only can you render on the server, but also maybe you want to render with no JavaScript on the server. Well, what if we want to do a bit of both, where you pre-render on the, not pre-render, render on the server and then hydrate on the client. So I knew we had to deal with this concept, but we also know that in Redwood, we don't do file system routing. So these are the three things I had to start up with. And really, there's with a README, I wouldn't know where to start. So when you have a problem like this, how do you deal with it? So the first thing when you have such a broad problem is that you want to limit the scope of what you're going to experiment with. So in my case, we had these two separate problems. We need to swap the bundler and we need to do SSR. But as soon as you swap the bundler, you're dealing with huge amounts of complexity. And as soon as you go into rendering on the server, that's a huge number of things that you need to deal with as well. So this is the most important thing. We want to limit the scope of what we're experimenting with. So find the smallest thing that you're going to be happy with once at the end of it. It's really important to figure out what you don't know, as in, you know, the path of, oh, okay, I don't have a solution for this yet, but maybe I can get Toby's help to solve this particular problem. So it's very important to have to find those things as well as find solutions for key things that you're looking at. When you do something like this, so as broad as this, where you swap out an integral part of the framework, you're going to break things and you're going to break things bad. So you have to fight the urge to fix every little thing, because otherwise you just do not make any progress whatsoever. And yeah, as a dev, we don't really deal with uncertainty that well. So really this talk about is about managing that uncertainty to make practical progress. So this is all of the things you're worrying about when you're talking about SSR and changing the bundler, but you don't really know where to start, right? So the first thing you want to do is you want to bite off the thing that you understand the least. So that's one way to do it, or maybe start with the easiest piece, depending on if you're ready for a load of pain or you'd rather ease into it. But either way, you want to bite off one chunk and forget all of the other things. So the first thing in practice was, how do you configure a Vite project? And once you configure a Vite project, how do you get it into Redwood? So I'm not even talking about SSR at this point. So what I did was, you go on the Getting Started guide, and Vite very helpfully have these pre-baked projects that you can go have a look at. So what I did was I looked at the React TS example, because I know TypeScript adds just a tiny bit more complexity. Thankfully with Vite, it's not a lot. But you start to realize, okay, this is how it works. You need a Vite config file at the top. You need to configure certain things. And then, very importantly, you need to have your files in a certain way for Vite to start working. So this is the base where I started from. It has nothing to do with Redwood, because Redwood itself has so many moving parts. You don't want to jump into that right away. You want to take the smallest piece that you don't understand, keep it away from Redwood, keep it away from the framework, understand it, and then we can move it up to the framework. So that was the first step that I did. once I had Vit working in my test project, so I cloned this repo, and then I started dialing up the complexity. So once I understand that roughly, then I can start looking at SSR and those sort of things. So it's very important when you do this that you look at prior art. So look at example repos. Something I've learned is that a lot of complexity in these example repos are hidden by the packet behind the package JSON, because we'll let that go through. So for example, we saw those files there and it's all working, but we're not seeing how do you do a build, how do you do dev? And it looks quite simple here, but as soon as you go into examples where, for example, in the Fastify bit, you start to realize, oh, wow, look, this is on its own before you understand anything. This is actually giving you a hint of what direction it's going to go. Because I can look at this and say, oh, actually, what's going to happen is I'm going to create a bundle for the client. I'm going to create a bundle for the server. And that's a very important step that you need to realize when dealing with bundlers and swapping this out. So whenever you look at an example project, first step, maybe go take a peek at the package JSON, because it might give you hints that will really simplify things without you having to dig and flail your arms for 3 days. So in practice, start with the template project, and then bundlers are incredibly complex tools. Vit itself is very, like from the outside, is very simple, but we know that Redwood has a tremendous amount of complexity in our current bundler, which is Webpack. So I use this file as a guide, because what we have here in the bundler is we have pretty much a bullet point list for me to hit every target. So I need to make sure when I configure Vit with Redwood that I'm dealing with CSS modules. I'm dealing with SAS, for example. I need to make sure that I'm loading these environment variables. I need to make sure that the other .env files are loaded. So it gives you a really good bullet point list that you need to check off. Because part of the problem is you're like, okay, well, I just try and swap it out, but then what's next? So you can go into the existing code and look at all of these things that it provides. We have written up, and then you can use that as a checklist for when you're doing this. So once you've slowly started integrating it, so for me, it was, okay, let me try integrating Tailwind. Did that work? Then let me try integrating the environment variables. So that I have in my example branch here, for example, these commits we want to look at. So I did it step by step to get Vit working in the first step to work with Redwood. I had to change this variable global, which is a Webpack concept. I worked this out very quickly because when you try to run it, it says global not defined. So that's step one. Then you go, okay, I think it's starting to build, but I probably need to bring in our Babel changes. So I bring in Babel. Then I realized, oh, okay, I'm missing the environment variables. So let's move the logic into the Vit world. So this is an example where I'll be like, okay, process.env isn't supported in Vit the same way. You can make it supported, but let me make that change and it'll start to come through. And finally, as you get more and more closer to the project, then you can start doing things like switching the dev command to Vit. If you started with switching the dev command to Vit, I feel like that level of complexity you wouldn't be able to handle at that point in time. So it's really important to do that. And this other tool that I've been doing, that I've been using, is whenever, let's see, do I have an example here where if I'm making changes that are relevant, I'm using these mark tags. Actually, I think I have it in the other repo. So here, this is the example where I'm using Vit with Redwood. So here you will see throughout the code base, I can't find it. Okay, I'll just pick out a commit. There we go. This should have examples. So you can see every little configuration change I made, I marked out. And this is a very important step when you're doing something that's so broad, because A, you will forget, and B, when Aditya asks, hey, Danny, why did you do this? You have an answer in the code, right? Because by the time we start building this as a team, I probably won't even remember. So it's important you do this with something this broad. It's important to realize that when you're picking up something new, that learning in software is not linear. Every step of the way, you gain some knowledge and then you stall for a little bit because maybe the complexity is too high, or maybe you just need to explore more horizontally at that point. So you have to accept that you're not going to solve everything in one go. So to work around this, I started with these two examples where I started to try using their example of how to do SSR. So these two I'm going to open up, Vit plugin SSR. They have excellent documentation, and this is a really, this is where README-driven development comes in. When you read through the documentation, you start to realize, oh, okay, there are things that I hadn't thought of before. And I'll come back to that in a second. How do you deal with that as well? So this is one I started with looking at, but I quickly realized this one uses file system routing as a base, where everything has to be defined, every root has to be defined on the file system. So when I tried to get it working, it clashes with our Redwood philosophies of having all of the roots defined in one root file. So I realized, okay, maybe I probably want to start approaching it the other way. And I realized Fastify Vit is slightly closer to what we're looking at. So there's a whole bunch of examples. I went through each of these examples. I cloned each of these examples. I tried configuring Tailwind, whatever, in each of these examples, just to get my knowledge up a little bit. So this is not getting me towards the goal of getting SSR in, but it's getting me, letting me understand that, look, I need to get to this point first before I can move on to the next level. So it's important you do that when the complexity is so high. But later on, I found another super cool tool, because we've been talking about complexity being so high and there being so many things to do. I started using mind maps. And I think this was really when I started to make progress, because I found myself spinning my wheel, not really getting anywhere because I had too much on my mind and I'm trying to solve everything at once. So I started doing these mind maps where I'm like, okay, these are the legs I need to follow. But when I'm doing server-side rendering, okay, what are the things that I need to solve here? So let's start listing them down like that. When I do hydration rendering, what are the pods or what are the things that I don't know? I will list them as soon as I come across something, I list them in. What about ISR, pre-render, so on and so forth. And you can see how the complexity keeps just going up and up and up. So this, I found an invaluable tool. You can do it on a piece of paper or software, whatever you want to do. And the way you use this when you're doing this experimental work is let's say today I want to figure out how do I know which bundle to include on the page. So you follow one path and don't stray from it. As soon as you discover, or maybe you're speaking to someone, someone mentions, oh, I don't think you've solved this, or maybe we need a solution for this. You just add another leg and leave it there. I think it's a very important step to offload this from your thinking, so that you're breaking off the complexity into smaller parts. And on that mind map, I'm not solving everything, but I'm solving some of the legs, so that we have enough within the core team to understand how we're going to use it. And finally, have a lot of conversations. This is not new. You know, rubber ducks are the best thing ever. Over the course of exploring this, I've had conversations with people from Jonas from Fast 5it, a lot of conversations with Toby, which really helped me understand what I'm trying to do. And often you will have bugs in your experimental code that are like maybe one line changes that you did for something you were trying before. But when you try to explain that, all of a sudden you realize where bugs are coming from. So I remember I was stuck for like 4 days trying to get the router to work on the server side, and I just couldn't figure it out. And within half an hour with Toby, we realized I just had a bug in my setup. That's why it just wasn't working. So that's where you will save a lot of time, because you're butting your head against a brick wall most of the time. When you do that, find someone to talk to, find someone to explain what you're trying to do. You'll probably figure it out. If not, the other person, it might give you something with a fresh perspective. And of course, it motivates you, because for 4 days when you're stuck on a problem, you really start to feel terrible about it. So yeah. So this is the other thing I talked about: offload things as quickly as possible. So I'll give you another example of a mind map that I was using. So this is where I started to explore what virtual modules are in Vite. So this was in relation to, how do I know what bundle to inject into the page? Or when I hover a link, how do I know what page to preload? So that was the context of this. And I broke it off. And then I realized, wait, there's so many parts to this topic alone. So you really start breaking them down into individual legs. And then you pick one leg and you try and solve it. Once you've solved it, or once you've reached enough of an understanding, you say, okay, now on to the next leg. Otherwise, what happens is you just never get to the end of a solution. So this comes from an old Scrum Master I used to have. This really holds true when it comes to this sort of thing. Stop starting, start finishing, stop trying to explore all of these unknowns that we have, and just pick one and try and get that to the end. And you don't need to solve every single leg, because yeah, with something this big, for one person, it's quite a challenge. Writing it down either as a mind map or as a list really helps keep these ideas off your memory. I think mind maps are great because it gives you an organized way of following certain paths. Lists don't really give you that. You also might find, for example, with this, for about 2 months nearly, I had no solution to removing the JS bundle, and I left it there. I didn't look at it. Yeah, but somehow, I don't know exactly how, but I figured it out 2 months later based on someone said something, or I read some documentation, and all of a sudden I'd figured out that piece. So it's okay to have these things that you don't know until it comes along and you figure it out. And that's more or less it. Go explore the unknown. Cool. Hopefully that wasn't too meta. I tried to keep it like related. No, not too meta.
No, that was great. It was, yeah, walking through your process and the example was really helpful. So I had a couple questions about some next steps, but I'll let other people chime in first. And yeah, I know we're over the hour, but let's go another 7 minutes if we've got it. Anyone?
Yeah, sure, I'll go first. You mentioned stepping away from your actual problem and start building out something small instead. Like instead of trying to immediately get Vite into Redwood, you started off by building a tiny Vite project that had nothing to do with Redwood, just to get a feeling of that thing first. One thing that I found useful sometimes is not doing that, but instead going the other way and looking at Redwood and seeing if you can find just a tiny thing you can swap out for the thing that you want to use eventually. And then you build on that instead, and you swap out more and more things until you finally have the thing that you want to build fully integrated into Redwood. That's usually very hard. So most of the time what happens is I start with that, and then I hit the roadblock somewhere like half the way. And then I do what you suggested and go from the other way, and hopefully they can meet in the middle somewhere. So that's just another way of going about it that sometimes is useful. The second thing I wanted to bring up was you mentioned looking at prior art to see how other people have solved these things, and that's obviously super helpful and a great way to do it. One thing I worry about doing that though is that we end up just copying other people instead of innovating on our own better solutions. So do you have any thoughts on that? How do you keep innovating instead of just copying?
Yeah, so when I say prior art, I mean, as long as these solutions fit your description. So for example, the file system routing is something we've wanted to stay away from. It really started dawning on me why Next and Remix, a lot of these SSR-based frameworks want to do file system routing. And that's just because when you're rendering on the server and the request comes through, it's easy to know what page to load, right? So the way you prevent yourself from doing the same thing is to say, what are the things that you really want to hold on to? So in this case, it was single file routing. So we want to define all our routes in this one file because that's like one of the fundamental philosophies of the router. And so the only way I stayed away from that, I guess, is by saying I'm not going to let myself do file system routing. And then yes, it's harder, but you start to find solutions and maybe you can innovate. But the other thing is, for me, the hard part is when you're so deep in something like this, it's impossible to think at a super high level. So this is why you have conversations with Tom, for example, or have conversations with the wider team to say, this is what I'm thinking. This is why I did the presentations a while ago to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. And then someone else will come up with the idea to say, well, what if we do this crazy thing? Doesn't mean you need to implement it right away. It just means maybe that seeds an idea that you might use later on.
Thanks, very good.
Danny, one of the things we talked about leading up to this presentation is what does it look like to take the research and work you're doing and really enable collaboration going forward, right? How do you take this information you're generating and hand it off to people, right? I think we looked through that, by the way, as a great tool. That was MindNode. That's what the tool was? Yeah. I think we looked at that and you kind of went through each branch and you're like, how can I hand these things off, right? Like I can't, you were already future thinking to like, if this is all on my shoulders, it's a massive project. So how will we break down this project to hand it off for collaboration? So, I mean, thoughts on that? Where does the information go? Where do the learnings go? How do you go from where you are now, right? So that the research becomes collaborative by nature. Like, Or is that the part we want to figure out next? So I know we don't have an answer, but that's why I asked you to present on this, right?
I don't know. So so next steps for me is to go through line by line of every single configuration that I've done with the team, and then what we need to do is like rebuild that mind map to say, this was the initial mind map that I had, but maybe now we can start to build it from like how can we create tickets for it, right?
Right.
So we can think from that perspective, and then try and break off the work with everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, and and where does that? Yeah, so GitHub issue. I guess we have Notion docs for things, but okay. But that's so I wanted to ask that question too, so that everyone could be thinking about that. How for projects like this that have massive scope, highly ambiguous at the start, how does that? It's got to start with one person, right? It seems like that's the best way. People really have to go into a deep dive and venture off into the wilderness and collect things and come back. But once you've gathered up everything in your pack after being in the wilderness, you spread it all out to the team. Then how do we organize and then collaborate on that work? So that's for us to figure out next. Danny, great job. Excited to see. I mean, I know it's been a lot of work, but excited to see where you are now. That was a really good overview too, and get this stuff turned into features in Redwood. Nice work.
I think we really need to be explicit about the need to collaborate, because even by just putting it out there, like just writing it down or just providing a link to some README or a graph or something, that's probably not gonna help it. No one is gonna jump in probably. So it's best to be explicit about it and invite people to meetings and talk about it and really ask for help, I think.
Exactly, yeah. I think we learned from before part of V1 that silos of knowledge come back to bite us, right? So this time I want to make sure with something so fundamental to the framework, like there's nothing, as soon as you switch fit, there's nothing it doesn't touch. Every single part of the framework is affected. So we need to bring everyone along for the ride. I don't want to silo this information. So yeah, the next step is the deep dive call, which I'm trying to arrange, which is hard across time zones. So let's see.
All right, thank you. I'll stop the recording here and